Good morning and welcome to the Well. If we haven't had a chance to meet you, my name is Danny. I'm one of the pastors here at our church and just excited and glad that you're here in worship with us today, especially if it's your first time. It takes a lot of courage to come and try a new church. We say it every week because we believe that to be true. It takes a lot of courage to come and to try any church, to return to church, but to certainly try a new church. And so we're excited that you would do that. And as the screen says, we're in a sermon series called Passing the Torch, where, as Anne-Marie said, we're talking about what it looks like to raise up the next generation. But I was even talking to one of our small groups this last week. I had a great opportunity to come to one of our well groups and chat with them a little bit. And it was really interesting because they brought up the idea of certainly it's about raising up the next generation, which is our littles and our teens and whatnot, but it's about all of us as well. Like some of us are in our 20s or 30s or 40s and 50s, and we're like, how do we get invested and how do we get raised up? And so please know, we're certainly talking about a younger generation, but those of us that were excluded or left out or just trying to figure out how we are developed, we're all a part of this, and the principles that we put in here certainly have actionable steps for all of us in any level of our lives. But today, as we talk about raising up the next generation, we've kind of talked about actionable things, like do this and try that. And this week, I want to talk about silence and the role that silence plays in the way that the next generation is formed. Because some of us might think this, noise and speaking is positive or sometimes negative, but silence is neutral. And I would challenge it to say that silence is never neutral. Silence is always speaking. And I want us to challenge to think about what role do our words and actions play, and how does silence actually play a part in what we're communicating, because silence does communicate things, right? And I was thinking back to this, and I don't know that this is the most emotionally healthy and fully formed story, but I was thinking back to when I played high school baseball. My high school baseball coach, certainly a lovable guy, but he was a screamer. Man, this guy would yell at us till he was blue in the face. And he would tell us at the beginning of the season, he's like, I want you to know that if I'm yelling at you, it's because I care about you. I do think in a weird twisted way he did mean that. But he would say, if I'm yelling at you, it's I want you to be better. I'm trying to coach you. I'm trying to move you along. But here's where you should be nervous is if you don't hear me say anything, that's where you should be nervous. And what he was saying there, whether that's emotionally healthy or not, what he was saying is my words say something, but my silence is actually communicating something as well. And in more emotionally healthy ways, but also we probably have emotionally unhealthy ways that we go about that as well. As we look at this, I want us to explore, certainly there are going to be times where we want to speak up, and certain times where we will speak up, and certain times where we'll forget to speak up. Those are all going to happen. There's also going to be times where we are silent on purpose or an accident or out of fear or out of whatever, and those speak something too. And I want to challenge us to consider what we would believe and what it would mean for us as followers of Jesus and people that are invested not just in our own personal lives, but in the lives of those around us. What do our words and actions say, and what does our silence speak? And so what I would like us to do, though, before we get into this, because you might be sitting next to someone, whether it's a friend or your spouse or your partner, you might be I actually don't agree with that. One of you might be actions are all that matters, and the other one would be silence does speak something. And so there might be myriad of this. So I want you to think really quick and maybe chat with the person next. If you don't know them, introduce yourself. But what role do you think silence plays in communicating? Do you think silence does speak volumes? Do you think it's deafeningly loud sometimes? Do you think it is neutral? When you think about silence, where do you think that fits in? So take 60 seconds, 90 seconds. What role do you think silence plays? We'll come back together here in just a moment. I always, and I do mean this, deeply appreciate when I can feel the conversation is filled with energy. And this seems like one that perhaps you've had your own sets of opinions and thoughts on. I mean, we were even talking just in the front, there is a difference in types of silence, right? I'm someone that feels I talk for a living, but sometimes I feel like everyone wants my opinion. Spoiler alert, that's not always true. But there's a difference between creating space for other people and being silent, and then being silent to injustice, right? There's a little bit of choosing in how we go about this. And so I would just say it's not a monolith of a one-size-fits-all. Like, really thinking about, like, where does my silence communicate something? So if I'm creating space for someone else in my silence, that is communicating something. You're valued. I want to hear your opinion. I want you to be a part of this. Like, it is always communicating something, but say there's an injustice going and I'm silent in that, like, what does that communicate? Like, maybe it doesn't matter, or maybe I'm not interested, or maybe my safety is more important than my courage, right? Like, there is something that is communicated always in our silence, but how we utilize silence or how maybe we manipulate silence is different circumstance. And so that is an interesting nuance that we hit here as we were just talking of, like, understanding that it certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of answer to what silence is and what silence does in different spaces. But I would say that both our words and our silence do speak volumes. And in a couple of passages, one we've already hit already during the course of this series, but maybe it's new to you if you missed that week, is Deuteronomy 6 says, talk about God's commands at home, on the road, in the morning, at night. This is about kind of passive, active, or not a passive, but an active faith. Like, everywhere we're going, we're talking about it. But Psalm 145 says, one generation commends the works of another, and they tell of your mighty acts. This one's not about assuming or hoping someone notices, but this is kind of about telling people what's going on. And so there's maybe more silent, like action-oriented in terms of passing it on, and other people are telling the story. And so we're not as worried about our words sharing it, but our actions, and then it's being passed along. But there's some level of both happening as we look into how we navigate our role of silence and what that looks like for us. But it's important for us, and this is what I would challenge you to really think about. Like, silence never leaves nothing behind. Like, silence will always leave something behind. So if I'm creating space for someone, that's value, that's inclusion, that's feeling like you're a part of something. Like, silence can leave something really positive behind. But again, maybe in the space of an injustice, like, it's leaving behind maybe a thought of apathy or a lack of commitment to something, or maybe the dehumanization of someone is I don't speak. Like, there is something always being communicated both in our words and in our lack of words. And that's, I said this to the last service, like, I don't mean that in an overwhelming sort of way. That sounds overwhelming, like, oh my gosh, I'm always responsible for myself. And I think about that in social media and what I say to my kids and all that stuff. But in some ways, it's also uplifting as we look at it, because it is never about being perfect, but it is always about being intentional and growing and considering and wrestling. But thinking about this, like, what happens if we don't talk about our faith? Like, if we come into this space, like, we only talk about Jesus, faith, Bible here, and we have kids, or we have nephews, or we have nieces, or we have other people in our lives, like, what does that communicate to them? That communicates something to our kids. Maybe they assume that faith isn't that important. Maybe they assume it's a 1 hour on 1 day a week thing. Maybe they assume it's compartmentalized. Like, I don't know what it always communicates, but if the only time that we have conversations about life and faith in the intersection of that, then that communicates something to those around us, whether it's our friends or our children. If we don't tell stories about God's justice or the role of God in areas of justice, I think that communicates something. Maybe we don't think God cares about injustice. Maybe we think that we don't have a role in pushing back injustice. Like, it communicates something as we don't engage in that conversation. What if we never share our struggles? Like, this was something that my church did growing up. Like, we never talked about our struggles. We never talked to, it was all about just showing up, and what they said now, I don't know if they use this language anymore, but we put on like our Sunday mask, and we looked really great, and we wore cool clothes, and we never talked about anything really that deep. That communicated something to me, as we didn't talk about our wrestling and our shortcomings, that maybe we think faith is a performance. Maybe we think faith is only about perfection. Maybe we think the community of believers is only for those who either have it all together, if we think they really do, or that are really good at pretending like they have it all together, right? Like, the things that we communicate verbally certainly tell a story, but there are implicit stories being told in the silence as well. And again, it's, I think, a responsibility for us to imagine and ask ourselves, like, what are the things spoken and unspoken communicating to the world around me, whether that's my friends, my family, my coworkers, my students, my kids, or whoever. So when we go quiet, and we are quiet, I think the generation to come doesn't hear nothing. They certainly hear something, and it's speaking volumes, but we maybe lose control of what that narrative is being communicated to us, right? Like my wife and I talk about this a lot. Like in the absence of clarity, we get to create the narrative, and then we sometimes create a really healthy one, and sometimes we create a really unhealthy one. Happens more times than not. And so it's like we have to understand, and we see this in our everyday lives, right? The real life implications of this, but sometimes we overlook it with our children, thinking that maybe it's the safest thing to not talk about something. Maybe it's the safest thing to pretend like something doesn't exist. Maybe it's the safest thing to avoid something, to really shroud it in silence. But again, it will always come around. It will always be talked about, and our silence in that moment will eventually communicate something about that. And so I was thinking of a really interesting story. We're actually going to be diving into the story of Esther later on in the months to come as we do a series kind of unpacking our strategic work. The book of Esther is like one of my favorites in all of Scripture, and an amazing book on the role of silence and what happens in that, both in the silence of God and the silence of ourselves and our voices and how we navigate that. But there's this really interesting interaction between Esther and this character named Mordecai. And they're standing on the brink of pushing back injustice. They're standing on the brink of pushing back really hurtful and harmful things happening to their people and their community. And Mordecai warns Esther by saying this: if you remain silent at this time, relief will come from elsewhere, but you and your family will perish. Super aggressive. That's like a lot to hear someone say to you. But what he's saying here in this is the first thing we hear in that, like, if you're silent, like, something will still be spoken. There's still going to be something happening, and the justice work of God is still going to be happening, but there's going to be real life implications to you and to those around you of what happens as you sit here in your silence. And in other words, I really do think he's trying to say, Mordecai to Esther, that like silence does have consequences. And in this instance specifically, and I would encourage you to read the entire story that's happening here, like silence really communicates complicity with what's going on. And certainly like Esther is navigating a set of emotions and feelings and wrestling with like what her role is. Like culture never gave Esther a chance to have a voice of power and influence, and now she's being told that she has this opportunity to have power and influence and a voice, and so she's wrestling with probably so many things that the text does not have time to get into internally, and many of us probably understand that feeling, but she is encouraged in this to understand that silence is never neutral. Silence does have some sort of formative or maybe deforming effect on not only us, but the world around us, and certainly in issues of justice. And I think the question that we ought to ask ourselves isn't if your silence is speaking, but what story is our silence telling? And that's in many ways what Mordecai is trying to challenge Esther to say. Because as aggressive as that statement sounds, he actually does follow it up with something quite encouraging, where he tells her, like, you actually were maybe created for such a time as this to actually do something that no one else could have ever done. That you were created and crafted in this moment for this time with skills and experiences, that your voice and your story can communicate something far stronger than your silence could ever communicate. Like, you were created for a time just like this to push back the things of injustice and hurt and sin and brokenness that are in the world. And I know sometimes it feels safer to be silent, and sometimes it feels more clean to be silent, and sometimes, especially for Esther, you might say like there's someone more gifted or talented or equipped for this. And Mordecai is trying to encourage her to say, like, maybe this was exactly the moment you were encouraged and created to speak up for and to fill that silence. And I didn't say this in the last service, but this just hit me as I was thinking this. Like, some of us need to be Mordecai, and some of us are Esther in this story, right? Like, some of us need to be the person standing next to someone, because we sometimes see what those around us don't have eyes to see, and be like, hey, maybe this is exactly what you were created for. Maybe this is exactly what God designed you for. You have a unique voice and a unique posture and a unique story to be able to speak into this. And many of us maybe feel like we're Esther, like we don't feel like we have any of those things designed for us in our lives, and there are those people around us continually trying to encourage us, like, hey, actually you do. And maybe you were created for such a moment and such a time as this to actually speak something prophetic and truthful that communicates the truth of God more than your silence ever could, inviting people in to a story of hope that they never knew existed. And so the challenge, I think, is asking ourselves, like, what are we communicating, both in our silence and both in our words, both in our activity and our inactivity, and realizing that neither of them can ever truly be neutral. Like, something is always being communicated. Again, if we don't speak about God's love, I think the next generation still learns something in that. Like, if we don't talk about the love, the grace, the inclusivity of Jesus, like, people are still learning something, both in our silence, but from what others are teaching around. Maybe they're learning that God's love isn't that compelling. Maybe it's not worth talking about. Maybe it's not really for all people. Maybe it's just for some in a select few. Like, what we don't communicate communicates something. If we don't stand against injustice, I think the generation to come learns that the status quo is more important and valuable than liberation for all. Maybe that our safety and our security is more important than the safety and the security of others. That our safety is more important than showing courage in areas that take a little bit of courage to speak up. If we don't tell our own stories of faith, and when I say our own stories of faith, I mean the successes, but also the failures, the wrestling and the successes, the doubts and the certainties, all of that, I still think they learn something if we don't talk about that maybe faith doesn't really matter that much and doesn't have that big of a role in our everyday life. I think our silence is always speaking something, and the real question is, like, will we pass on confusion, fear, anxiety, indifference, or will we pass on honest, courageous faith that is centered on love and on Jesus, both in the words we say, intentionally crafting, and but the way we live our lives in the things that are unspoken as well. There's a line from St. Francis of Assisi that says, preach the gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words. They're not certain if he said it, but it's attributed to him. But I think there's encouragement in that phrase, right? Because, like, we are always preaching something. And what he is encouraging those listening to understand is, like, if you are living a life that is centered around the power of Jesus, that is around creating more space, creating larger tables, tearing down walls and expanding the space for other people, like, that is the gospel message, far more compelling and probably more formative than any words we could ever say. And the challenge is to not feel like we have to have all our thoughts and our beliefs and our words perfect, because we never will. I stand up here every week in front of you guys and I mess it up every time. I listen back and I'm like, I wish I would have said it different this time. But the challenge is not in getting our words perfect or even our actions perfect, but being perfectly committed to being in a relationship with one another and walking it, right? And that's the beauty of community, right? Like, there's a burden in knowing that our words and our silence communicate something. Sometimes feels like a heavy burden. But like any burden that the church has, we are never enlisted and challenged to carry it alone. Like, we carry it together as parents and as aunts and as uncles and as coaches and teachers, as Anne Marie is the parent and Amy Swanson is the teacher, right? There's a community carrying the burden of life together. And as I think about that, it not only lessens the burden, but it tells me that I don't have to be perfect in how I do it, and that we might actually be able to walk faithfully and fully together in that pursuit. And that's my hope and my challenge for all of us as we think about this. Like, our words and our silence are always speaking something. They're always forming and they're always inviting. And the question is, what are we inviting people to? And so with that in mind, would you join me in a word of prayer? God, I know sometimes the challenge can feel overwhelming. It can feel like a burden to know that what we say has weight, but also what we don't say has weight. That the gospel is shared both in the times we think about what we want to say and really thoughtfully prepare it, but also in the times we are silent in our actions and our inactivity. It can feel like a burden. But God, again, we know that we were never created to do life alone, but we were never created to carry burdens alone, but we were created to carry them and shoulder them together, knowing that none of us were enlisted to walk this journey alone, but together we get to march wholeheartedly towards you. And so, God, I ask that you would help open our eyes to those of us that maybe need to be more like Mordecai, to encourage those around us to see how wonderfully gifted they are, both in their actions and their words, to speak truth into a world that desperately needs their unique voice. And for some of us that are like Esther, God, that have a voice and maybe don't believe in it, that you would help encourage and equip us to understand that we have something to say. That we can speak truth into the silence, speak truth into the void, and help this world look far more like the person of Jesus and less like the broken and division that we usually see. So God, help us wherever we are, march wholeheartedly closer to you in every moment, in every way, in our words, in our actions, in our silence, in our words, that we might be able to share the hope in the gospel message, a gospel of hope and transformation, abundant life, not just for some, but for all in Jesus. So now I got to prepare our hearts and our minds for communion, for the songs that we continue to sing. Let them be prayers we lift up to you. We pray this all in Jesus' name.